another update on building the body of the car. I haven't driven it since the last time. I've sort of parked it back in here, and I'm going to focus on doing some of the timber work now. I have clamped the bottom rails in place, and I've sort of started marking out where things need to go. I had it marked out in tape before anyway. I've redone that just to double check my measurements. There's masking tape stuck to the top of the chassis, and I'm using that flat sheet of MDF at the front of the car. Because I've got my CAD model, I can use that as a reference plane, and I've been taking all my measurements back from that, so I know where everything sits, and I sort of double check everything in relation to the cross members and that kind of thing. But those bottom rails are in place, and now that I've got a new bandsaw blade, I actually got two, I cut out the first of the hoops, basically using the same technique I did with the MDF, only I'm paying a bit more attention to where the corners are and how the grain runs. Obviously in MDF, that stuff there, that was just to get the shape right. There's no grain to worry about. But on this, I want to make sure I maximize all the long grain. So I've cut out some pieces, and then I had to play around with how I join them together. And I did discover there is this joint called a spline joint. And this is one of my test pieces, so this is a loose fit. Basically, you cut slots in the ends of the pieces of timber, so there's a slot in this and a slot there, and then you make tight fitting pieces that go in between, and it all gets glued together. And with these pieces you can arrange the grain to go the direction that gives you the maximum strength. So obviously you have it going sort of that way. In order to make these slots, I played around with a few things. This is how I broke my bandsaw blade initially. I was trying to set up a fence that let me cut these slots on the bandsaw, and in the end I realized probably a better way was to use a router. And this timber is all about 30 millimeters thick. The recommended dimensions for these splines is the depth is 1/3 of the material width. So I bought a 10 millimeter router bit, and I made this kind of slightly dodgy jig, I guess it is. And the way I use this is I set it up all very carefully so that this gives me the 1/3 height for that cutter. And unfortunately my router is just a cheap Makita one. It doesn't have a way for me to lock the trigger down, so I have this cable tie that I have to sort of clamp onto it. Sorry, it's very sawdusty in here at the moment because I was doing all of this morning. When I do any of this stuff, obviously I'm wearing dust masks and goggles and earmuffs and trying not to breathe any of this in. But this is just basically a piece of 3mm aluminium. I bent this to the right sort of height. There's a right angle here. There's a block of wood under there that everything's screwed to, so I can clamp it in the vise. And there's just a piece of MDF on the top to give me a smooth surface. And all I do is power this thing up. I've got my dust extractor there, and I just do it slowly. I don't try to do it all in one go. I just take a few millimeters off each time, and that lets me cut that slot. To make sure it's even, I then turn the piece over and do it again from the other side, and that eliminates any slight offset in the cutter. And then to make the piece that fits in there, this is a piece of the piece I cut. Obviously on the bandsaw, what I was able to do is set up a little fence, and I can run scraps of ash, which I'm going to have a lot of, through the bandsaw like that, and that cuts me the flat insert piece. I'm not sure what it's called. I think these joints are also called a loose tenon joint, so that would be the tenon, I guess. But I cut these, and I cut them slightly oversized, because with the wood glue I'm using, you want a really tight fit. So I've cut them slightly over width, and then using my little sanding machine here, I can sand those down and get them to be a really nice tight fit into those joints. And that's what I've done here. These will all be glued up. I'm not sure if I need to screw them as well. I could put some screws through here. I don't actually think they're needed. I think if these are clamped up and everything's done up tight, it should work fine. But you can see how, like I say, this was my test piece and I made it too thin, but that goes in there. And I find I can just adjust things by hand and trim things by hand to get that to be a nice fit inside there. And you can see I've made them oversized, so I can glue it all up and then I can just trim them off. The nice thing about doing this is, again, from my CAD model, I've got all the measurements of the widths of things, plus I can double check on the actual chassis. But I get a little bit of adjustment here in these joints, but I can measure it up here, and even as a push fit, it makes these joints strong enough that I can actually pick this thing up before I've glued it and actually set it down on the chassis and make sure it all looks correct. So the next step is gluing those up, and I think what I'll do to make sure everything really sets nicely is anytime I glue anything, I'll leave it overnight, I think, to dry. I think I've mentioned before, these hoops are cut to sit on the chassis rail, and that's because I'm going to use a half lap joint at the bottom to join these to the bottom of the chassis rail. So it'll be something like this, screwed from the inside, because one of the things that you'd notice, you would if I could put this down, is of course the edges of the timber are square, but the sides of the chassis aren't. You can see it sort of sits in there. So my timber will sit on here, but it'll stick out because it needs to be finished. It'll need to be angled to match the body. So at the moment it's just flat. So I have to take all of that into account when I make these little joints here. I'll just have to really carefully cut these out and figure out exactly how I need to measure it and trim it, and I'll do all of that by hand to get a really nice tight fit. Somebody did mention epoxy glues. I looked into this quite a bit, trying to figure out what the best sort of glue is. Again, it's one of those things where people have their own preferences and you'll get 100 different opinions on what's best. From what I've read up, for things like this, the wood glue will give me a really nice strong joint if everything is a very tight fit. So that's why I'm going for those sort of joints there. The epoxy is better if you're trying to fill gaps, apparently. And I do have some epoxy, so I will leave that in case there's a need of gap filling, which probably means I've screwed up somewhere and haven't cut something neat enough. So maybe I'll use epoxy on any joints where my tolerances aren't quite as good as they should be. But that's kind of where I'm at with that. Like I say, I think the best way to do it is make the hoop and then figure out fitting the hoop onto the bottom frames, because I can then measure everything up and draw it up. The other thing to mention is there's actually quite a lot of steel bracketry that goes into this as well. Looking at pictures of originals, there's little steel angle pieces and braces that help strengthen all of the joints, support all of the joints. For example, around the rear, obviously you're going to have timber to here, and then from there back, and there's sort of a cutout for the axle to move up and down. There's actually a metal plate, or a metal, it's not a plate because it's not flat, it's sort of quite a complex shape, which I can make out of 3mm strap. I need to get some of that, and that sort of goes around, screws all the way around it to strengthen areas like that. And I think that's it for this update.